Welcome. We are going to let folks make their way in from the waiting room, and we will get started in just a moment.
Will, it looks like I can just click on share and it'll stop you and put me up, so we'll be okay.
We'll be totally good.
Perfect. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you to everyone joining us live for today's Lunch and Learn, Federal Indian Policy, Impacts on the Wabanaki Nations in Maine and Beyond. And welcome to all of the viewers watching the recording on YouTube. For at least the last several decades, federal Indian policy in the U.S. has supported tribal self-determination through tribal self-government. The results have included remarkable economic growth across most of Indian country and expansions of the responsibilities and capacities of tribal governments. And more tribes are the economic engines of their regions. As many of you know, things are different in Maine. The Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act of 1980 established a different, more restrictive status for the tribes in Maine than for all of the other federally recognized tribes. Denying the inherent sovereignty of the Wabanaki Nations has had a cascade of negative impacts, including dire consequences on the development of the Wabanaki Nation's economies and governmental capacities. A new report from the Harvard Kennedy School details the economic and social impacts of the restrictions on the applicability of federal Indian policies to the Wabanaki Nations in Maine. That's a mouthful, and it's an incredibly interesting report. We are honored to welcome one of the co-authors today, Professor Joseph Kalt. Professor Kalt is the co-director of the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. He has published widely in the area of natural resource economics and policy, and he has been making the rounds in Maine to share this vitally important report. Thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Kalt. My name is Kathleen Neal. I am the Senior Director of Policy and Partnerships here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to protecting Maine's environment and our democracy. MCA does that through education, collaboration, and advocacy, and MCV by influencing public policy, holding politicians accountable, and winning elections. A few technical notes for today. We will hear from Dr. Kalt first and then tackle your questions in the Q&A session at the end. You don't have to wait, though. You can send questions to me through the chat whenever they occur to you. I will compile them, synthesize the questions with similar themes, and ask as many of them as possible following the presentation. We ask that you not message Dr. Kalt directly, as we want him to be able to focus on the presentation, not the chat box. If you have any technical difficulties today, you can message Will Sedlak and he will help you out. This event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our website later this afternoon, where you can also find recordings of all of our previous Lunch and Learns. Thank you for joining us. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Kalt to get things started.
Well, thank you very much, Kathleen. And thank you all for having me here today. I'm coming to you from Tucson, Arizona, and but spent most of last week in the beautiful state of Maine. You gave me a good traffic with no icy roads, so I appreciate that. Thank you. As Kathleen said, colleagues and I at the Harvard Kennedy School have released a new report looking at the economic and social impacts of MICSA, the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act of 1980, on not only the Wabanaki Nations of Maine, but the non-tribal citizens of Maine as well. I should say that this research was partially funded by some support from the Wabanaki Nations. Routinely at the Kennedy School of Government, we do work for various governments from around the world. And in this case, it was these Indian nation governments that provided some of the support. But as always, we control all the editorial content, and the tribes had no editorial say over the output that we produced. With that background, let me give you quickly just the overview of the findings and say a word about the context. So I direct, as Kathleen said, the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development. And we've been working, as the title suggests, economic development, on issues of economic development across Indian America for more than 35 years. Not interesting, maybe embarrassingly enough, we had never focused particularly on the tribes in Maine. This gave us a chance to try to do that. And what we found in our research in this report is that first, MICSA, the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act, blocks the application of federal policies of what are known as self-determination that are applicable to the other 574 tribes, federally recognized tribes across the United States. But the MICSA contains provisions which allows the state of Maine to block the application of all federal policies if Maine feels that the federal legislation affects or preempts, is the phrase in the law, affects or preempts Maine's jurisdiction. We find that compared to non-Maine tribes, particularly in the lower 48 states, all four of the Wabanaki Nations lag severely behind in terms of economic development and in terms of their governmental capacities. And we conclude that the fact that all four of the Maine tribes are lagging so badly behind the rest of the nation's tribes is not due to something unique to Wabanaki Nations compared to other tribes, other than the presence of this Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act of 1980. We also find, and I'll talk about these results, that Wabanaki development, both its governmental capacity and its economy, the nation's economies, would benefit not only the Wabanakis, but of course, the Maine citizens in general. So those are the main conclusions coming out of this study. And I'll show you the results and where we got them. I want to start with a little bit of background on the impacts of federal self-determination policy and a tiny bit of the politics here. This policy of federal self-determination, which now increasingly has been self-determination for tribal nations through self-government, puts tribes elsewhere in the United States very much in the position of state and local governments. So tribes across the rest of the United States are performing widely the same functions that we all expect from state and local governments. They're running water and sewer departments, and they're running their court systems, and their cops, and their fire departments, and their highway paving, and their solid waste disposal, and their youth after school programs, and all kinds of programs, functions, and services that we expect of state and local governments. U.S. tribes are now performing those under these federal policies of self-determination. This self-determination framework actually began in earnest under President Nixon, with urging actually from Barry Goldwater. Goldwater was very deeply involved, as being from Arizona, with the Arizona tribes. And this policy started very much as a Republican style effort, or maybe old style Republican. I won't go there in this talk, but get the federal government out of these people's lives, get the state government, let people run their own affairs was this rhetoric of the time. And this was embodied in a Nixon administration executive order, eventually signed into law in 1975. The initial phase of the self-determination policy basically had the tribes, gave them the capacity to elect to take over what had become this wide array of federal policies and programs on reservations. So a tribal government could take over, for example, its police force, previously run by the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs. The cops would now become employees of a tribal police department, and the federal monies would go to the tribal police department instead of to the federal program. For the first decade and a half, this was administering other governments, i.e. the federal government's programs, and wasn't very successful. In the late 1980s, 88 and 89, the federal government, United States Congress, adopted the self-governance amendments to these acts. And from that point forward, tribes have really had capacity to, yes, they still get some federal monies, just as do the states, but the tribes have had this capacity to go out and build their own governmental capacity, run their programs under their own policies and so forth. And this has produced a 30-year economic boom in Indian America across the rest of the United States. Outside of Maine, since 1989, Indian incomes on reservations have grown 3.5 times faster than the incomes of average Americans. So there's this economic boom that people don't understand, don't see very often, but it's happened widely across the United States, where on reservations, Indian citizens have been growing in terms of their economic well-being much more rapidly than the rest of the United States. This has cut reservation poverty outside of Maine basically in half. And this is a dramatic improvement in what had for decades, if not centuries, American Indians on reservations were the poorest identifiable group in the United States. And that's being reversed now under these federal policies of self-determination. And outside of Maine, more and more tribes are becoming the economic and municipal service engines of their regions, providing the local health clinic, serving both Indian and non-Indian populations, paving the roads, providing water and sewer, providing fire protection, 911 emergency dispatch, schools, et cetera. This is not happening in Maine, and that's part of the story here. Here's real quickly just the data. This is showing you the growth in real, meaning inflation adjusted per person income in the United States as a whole. Since 1989, we get the data in basically from the US Census. This is all US Census data. Since 1989, the average US citizen has seen 17% growth in personal income, per person income. It's actually quite slow. This is the stagnant middle class you hear so much about and so forth. Here's what's happened in Indian country. Indian country, by the way, is a technical legal term that the tribes use to describe the fact that they are federally recognized tribes. Outside of Maine, in Indian country, lower 48 states, here's Indians on reservations. This is striking, folks. This is phenomenal, because prior to this dawn of self-determination, growth in Indian country had remained stagnant or declining after adjusting for inflation for decades. And yet, with the dawn of self-governance in the late 1980s, we see this boom in economic development across Indian reservations. Measures of income are not the only things that reflect the qualities of people's lives, but they're one of the important ones, because it means food on the table, a roof over your head, kids have better school books. I mean, all of those things are associated with this. Here's what's happened to poverty. I mentioned, and you can see here, AIAN is the US Census designation for American Indian Alaska Native. This is American Indian Alaska Natives on reservations, poverty relative to other groups and the total United States. And you see back in the late 1960s, this is when the pressure was on the Nixon administration to do something. You see more than half of all families with children were living in poverty on American Indian reservations, and much greater than any other group identifiable in the United States. But, and you look at the far right of this data, and you see this dramatic improvement in Indian country. And in fact, what you see now is relative to the rest of the United States, we've now got Indian poverty now lower than some other identifiable groups as in 2020. And so we've had this more than cutting in half of the poverty on Indian reservations. Why the strong economic growth? it's quiz time from the professor. So your brain probably says, at least for some of you, it's been gaming. It's been gaming. That is the casino revolution. And to be sure, the ability of tribes to adopt one of the other powers that state governments have, which is to go into the gambling business. State of Maine has a lottery, state of Massachusetts has a lottery, the state of Arizona has a lottery. So these government gambling businesses of tribes have also been very productive of economic development for tribes. Here's some data on that. Here's the first decade of the gaming revolution, which started with the passage of a federal law and some legal cases in the late 1980s. During that period of the first decade of tribal gaming, tribal casinos, about half of the tribes had casinos and half of them didn't. And during that period, for the average American, again, per person, inflation adjusted, real income during that decade of the 90s grew 11%. And here's the data for the gaming tribes. Here are American Indians on reservations with casinos in that first decade of the gaming revolution for tribes. And you can see the tribes are growing more than 3 times faster than the general income of the general American, the average American. That's maybe not surprising to you, but I told you only half of tribes had casinos in this decade. Here's the growth, economic growth of tribes without casinos. Not quite as high as the casino tribes, but they were also growing about 3 times faster. And this is important. First, the casino revolution, in terms of economic impact, its big impact are for tribes that are located near major metropolitan areas. So you get the Mohegans in Connecticut and Pequots in Connecticut. And sure enough, they're situated between Boston, Providence, Hartford, and so forth. Yeah, it's been fabulous, huge operations. But for many tribes, the casino is literally, I tour Indian country a lot, I work with tribes. Many tribes, their casino is a little house trailer with a couple of slot machines in it. It's you're out in the middle of nowhere. And then for many tribes in that first decade, it wasn't the casinos. It's been self-determination and self-governance that has freed up tribes to take on a whole array of economic activity. And so as you look across economic activity now across Indian America, and this is what you don't see in the media, because the media mainly is in big metropolitan areas, so they pick up the big casinos. But tribes are running the kinds of things you see on this slide: hotels, restaurants, fishing and hunting operations, bowling alleys, museums. It turns out, for example, health clinics are a major boom industry for tribes because they figure out they're actually faster on their feet often than the county government or the state government. So the tribes develop the regional health clinic in some rural area, and they start serving both native and non-native customers or patients in those health clinics. Construction firms, interesting one on their distilleries during COVID. It made the national news. You will remember the shortage of hand sanitizers early on during COVID. Well, part of that shortage was beaten back by one of the tribes who has a distillery, was the first in the country to be able to convert from making alcohol beverages to hand sanitizer. But it's convenience stores and farms and on and on and on in terms of the thickening up of tribal economies. And this is what we're seeing across Indian country. The growth across the rest of Indian America is also not about federal spending. Some people think, even with respect to the debate you all are having in Maine about the tribe sovereignty there, the economic development comes because the tribes with self-determination get a big influx of federal dollars. That's not true. The economic development, as I'll say in a moment, comes from the self-government, not from some great influx of federal spending. And in fact, federal spending in Indian America in real dollar terms prior to the COVID relief stuff that states and tribes received, real spending by the feds had peaked actually in the Carter years and had been declining in real terms. Here's quickly data. Tribes in the US are increasingly fiscally independent. We've done work looking at the 23 tribes in the state of Washington immediately prior to the pandemic. And here's how their governments were functioning. These are tribes operating fully under these policies of federal self-determination through self-governance. What we find is that almost 80% of all of the revenue that these tribes are operating under is coming from tribal self-government, either their businesses, that is their enterprises, whether they be casinos or hotels or golf courses or whatever they might be, and taxes, leases, timber stumpage, and so forth, with less than 20% coming from federal grants and contracts. So this era of self-determination kind of achieved, I guess, what Barry Goldwater and Richard Nixon wanted to, which was to try to break the cycles of dependence of these tribes on the federal government. Interestingly enough, if you look at this data in that 18% number, the state of Maine's general revenue fund is made up by about 34% in federal aid. In other words, the state of Maine is more dependent than tribes on federal aid. So this image that somehow tribes are, living on welfare and dependence on the feds, there's some dependence, but it's lower than most states, including much lower than the state of Maine. We have a big program we run at the university that tries to find and then document and let tribes learn from each other best practices in these tribal government programs across everything from juvenile justice to housing to courts, everything. And here you see the degree of federal dependence of these very high-performing programs. They're about that same range of Maine, 34%. You see this kind of levels of federal dependence. So it's not federal spending or some gigantic influx of federal monies that's causing this economic boom. It's actually the federal policy shift to self-government. A word about that. Why the improved performance under self-government? It goes back to a little bit of sort of basic, political science 101 or something like that. What we find is that the local self-government improves the accountability of decision makers because they're local now. If all the decision makers on the reservation were answering to bosses in Washington, D.C. or in Augusta, Maine or whatever, that's one thing. But what self-determination does is shift accountability right down to the local, the tribal politicians and officials. And the apocryphal or the illustrative story, I was working with a tribe in Washington State. This tribe was really working hard on self-determination, taking over all its programs, setting up essentially those local government functions. And the tribal chairwoman, very wise woman, says to me, she says, Joe, it used to be when anything went wrong, we'd all blame the federal government or the state. But now when something goes wrong, she says, the people blame me. And then because she's a politician, she says, and that's the way it should be. But in her little story is that notion, it is improved accountability that allows for better sensitivity to local needs and the injection of local values into the decisions that are made. Should we spend our money more on the schools or on the healthcare? Those kinds of balancing questions are real for any politician. And what we've seen across Indian country, and I won't bore you with the nerdy statistics, but we see a steady pattern as tribes, for example, take over their timber operations. They don't shut down their timber operations. They tend to run them much more efficiently, both economically and ecologically. So they get more out of their forest without doing things like increasing their allowable cuts or anything like that. They manage their forests more productively without ecological damage. Tribes that take over their healthcare, they produce shorter waiting times. Notorious across Indian country was the Federal Indian Health Service, it's called, programs, waiting times, and a friend story, but it's illustrative, needs disc surgery on his back, and he waits like 3 years to get in line for that. Tribal takeover here, self-government has allowed better accountability. The local patients in the health clinic scream at the local politicians if the health clinic is run poorly, and it produces shorter waiting times and better satisfactions. The data tell us that tribes that take over financial management produce higher rates of return on their investment. You think, well, what's that about? Higher rates of return mean you have more money now to reinvest in the schools, in the roads, in the trash collection, in the law enforcement, and so forth. Tribes that take over housing had units that were more solvent and kept in better repair. Tribes that take over education, they start changing the curriculum. doing things like putting their native language in the schools relative to the old federal schools. And what happens is you improve scores on science and math, for example, and you also improve graduation rates. At the same time, you're restoring tribal culture through the cultural components of education. Tribes that have excluded from self-government have languaged economically. We saw that in the decades leading up to self-government with my little chart that showed you the big run-up that started in the late 1980s. But we have data on Alaska where there's a different regime that restricts self-government, data on Canada where there are restrictions. And you find that the restrictions put on tribal nations around their ability to govern themselves, make their local decisions themselves, they're the ones who are the most desperately poor now. In this framework, now turning to Maine, in this framework, the Wabanakis have not been able to keep up. That line you see on the screen right now is what I showed you before. That's other tribes in the United States with this economic boom since 1989. Here are the Wabanakis. This should be very discouraging, if not embarrassing, to the state of Maine, because the Wabanakis are systematically underperforming the tribes in the rest of the United States, with only over 3 decades, that's like 1/3% a year, only a 9% increase in people's incomes in the Wabanaki Nations. Here's how the Wabanakis compare. I showed you data a moment ago on poverty, like children living in poverty, for example, relative to the rest of the United States tribes. Here's Maine, and here is the data for the Wabanakis. Here's their per person income versus the state of Maine. And you can see the dramatic difference between the average Mainer's income and the income of the average tribal citizen of Maine. Here's poverty on the rest of Maine, 15% poverty for Maine as a whole. But here are the Wabanakis with these shockingly high rates of poverty. Because remember, for the rest of the United States, Indian poverty on reservations is down in the low 20s now. And here you see rates 40%, up to over 70% poverty, children living in poverty in the rest of Maine. So the Maine tribes stand out. The Maine tribes stand out because they are so economically depressed relative to the state of Maine and relative to other tribes in the country. We've been hit with maybe it's because the Maine economy was so bad, was doing so poorly over this period. It's the Maine economy holding the Wabanakis back. Here's the data on the Maine, here's the data on the Wabanakis, the rest of the United States. Here's the data on the Maine economy. You guys in Maine, you've actually been outperforming the rest of the United States. If anything, the Maine economy, relative to what other tribes are experiencing, the Maine economy should have been bolstering the growth of the Wabanakis, but instead we see the results you see for the Wabanakis. So you might be thinking, and as good Mainers, the only thing you've ever seen, probably, unless you've been traveling around the rest of the United States, are these desperately poor Indian reservations in Maine. What we've done in this, sort of nerdy chart, is we've tried to compare the Maine tribes. I'm going to show you the Maine tribes relative to their peers and across at least 2 important dimensions. How rural are the Maine tribes and how large or small are they? The Maine tribes are relatively rural. In this chart along the bottom, you're seeing the little dots represent a tribe somewhere outside of Maine. And the little dots are those tribes. Along the bottom, what you're seeing is how close the tribe is to a major metropolitan area. So the dots on the bottom right out there near 10 million people, these are the Southern California tribes near Los Angeles, for example, okay? And as you move to the left, you're seeing more and more rural tribes. And then we're gonna look at the full-time equivalent employees. How large is the tribe's operations? The Maine tribes are relatively small. So as you go up on the left axis there, you're seeing larger and larger tribes in terms of their operations. Maine tribes are relatively small. The line through the chart just tells you the average. The upward slope tells you that, yes, being rural tends to hold you back. If you're living in the middle of Los Angeles, on an Indian reservation, you basically have a jobs machine called Los Angeles, and people have a better chance of getting jobs and so forth. But here's how the Maine tribes compare to their peers: Micmac, Maliseet, the Passamaquoddies, Indian Township and Pleasant Point, and Penobscot. The shocking thing here is that the Maine tribes are systematically underperforming their peers. Indeed, they're actually the lowest dots in many cases. When you compare these tribes to their peers, you think of looking sort of vertically there, those are peers of the Penobscot, those are peers of the Maliseet, and so forth. This is important from a research point of view. You might have expected, well, the Maine tribes would sort of sparkle around the line like the rest of the tribes. Some would be doing poorly, some would be doing okay, some would be doing about average. But in fact, the fact that all of the Maine reservations, Passamaquoddy split in two here, all of the Maine reservations from the four tribes, all of the reservations in Maine show these dramatically underperforming economies. We think that the reason for this is that, as I've said at the start of this little talk, it's because MICSA, the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act, is blocking the application of federal policy. The Maine legislature commissioned a task force to look at this, and in a study cited by that task force, over the years from 1980 to 2019, when the study was done, there were 151 pieces of federal legislation. Not a single one of them contained language that would have allowed Congress to override that affect or preempts language. And consequently, these federal laws were essentially blocked in terms of their applicability to the tribes in Maine. The effects or preempts language in MICSA gives the state of Maine a low-cost veto over the application of federal policy in Maine. Give you the flavor there. The Violence Against Women's Act, finally in 2022 amendments, includes language, the federal law, that overrides MICSA and allows the Violence Against Women's Act to apply to the tribes in Maine. The Maine tribes fought for 7 years to get that language. That's costly. It creates uncertainty. If every time you turn around, whether it's violence against women legislation or Clean Water Act or Child Protection Services, this puts effectively a damper on the ability of tribes to develop their tribal governments. And what we find is underdeveloped tribal governments, underdeveloped tribes and government. The impediment here isn't the access to federal funding, it's the stunted development. And you keep thinking, well, is there something special about the tribes in Maine? All of these tribes, I just pick on Penobscot, all of the tribes here to the northwest of my red lines are tribes that are more rural and smaller than Penobscot. And yet Penobscot is so underperforming. For those of you who don't have the ability that I've had over 35 years to drive around in rental cars and work with tribes all over the country, I'm going to take you on a quick field trip. Because I find that Mainers in general, even people who support the freeing up of the tribes in Maine from MICSA, the Mainers tend to not believe it could really happen in Maine. That is, that the economic development would really take hold in Maine for the tribes. But here's a tribe in Mississippi, just to give you a quick story on your field trip here. Mississippi Choctaw. Many of you have heard of the Trail of Tears, where President Andrew Jackson, before the Civil War, forced the tribes in the southeastern United States on the Trail of Tears. That is a long forced march, basically, to the state of Oklahoma. The Mississippi Choctaw are the Choctaws who hid from Andrew Jackson and the army and hid out in the pine forests of central Mississippi and around Jackson, Philadelphia, Mississippi area. And if you looked at this tribe at the dawn of self-determination in the 1970s and 80s and said, would this tribe ever develop? You'd say no. No natural resources, dirt poor, disorganized, et cetera. Today, if you go, and it's a weekday, so I've been there, there was a traffic jam as thousands of white and black workers came on the reservation for their jobs. This tribe I'm old enough, and I can't make any eye contact with any of you on the screen, and I won't dare. I'm old enough to remember the movie The Graduate. And there's a famous line in The Graduates: "Plastics, my boy, plastics." This tribe went into plastics manufacturing. And for decades, for example, the CD boxes that you bought your CD-ROMs in, those jewel cases, they were made by this tribe. They had a virtual monopoly on them. Even to this day, you find plastic forks and spoons at McDonald's and Wendy's, or made at Mississippi Choctaw. Their biggest business and customers have been Ford and General Motors. The inside of most of our automobiles now are plastic, and this tribe is famous and award-winning in their production of plastics, and this is plastic stamping material. The nature of this tribe, if plastics manufacturing doesn't go down very well with you, what have they done? They've turned around and plowed their economic success back into the community and invest in their own tribally run health clinics, dental clinics, etc. This tribe holds what we think is a world record, literally documented, in the decades of self-determination from 1985 to 2000, 15 years. In 15 years, they raised life expectancy in this community 20 years. This place is alive economically, culturally, physically, and in every relevant dimension. One other quick story, because you guys don't get to see this if you're in Maine, and if you don't quite in your gut believe that the Maine tribes can do this, here's an interesting tribe, Citizen Wabanaki Nation of Oklahoma. Documented, you can Google on their name. What you will find is in the late 1970s, at the dawn of self-determination for tribes, this is what the tribe consisted of: 2.5 acres of land, $500 in the bank, and that house trailer was their tribal headquarters. And the land behind it is the 2.5 acres. That's the tribe. That's the tribe. Today, this tribe is the economic engine of Shawnee, Oklahoma, the largest employer in the region. They own a big national bank with branches all over the United States, where good citizens of non-Indian citizens of Oklahoma don't know that a tribe owns their bank. They own the equivalent of Costco or Sam's Club, with a big box discount food and general store that is very successful and vertically integrated with their own cattle ranching and vegetables and so forth from their own farms, running through their big sort of Costco style store. They recently bought a railroad that's a very critical link to the nation's railroad system. And so this is a tribe that started with nothing, much poorer, much less likely to be a candidate of economic development than the Wabanaki Nations in Oklahoma. I mean, in Maine. Yet you see this success. In the process, they plow their work back into their efforts, back into their own health clinics, and they restore their culture. So you see these stories. I'm not cherry picking them, because as I told you, that picture with my 2 red lines and the little dots, everybody up in the northwest corner above those red lines, they were poorer when they started. They were smaller than they started than the Wabanaki Nations. What does a fully developed tribal government look like? I'm not going to ask you to look at these slides other than to see how many lines there are on them. These tribes have their own constitutions with their own court systems, their own executive branch, their own legislative branch, all the departments you expect of a well-functioning state government, with education, natural resources, tribal culture, economic development, so forth and so on. And they fully develop their laws, from their probate law to housing codes, to restaurant inspection codes, to, in this case, the tribe has gaming and boxing regulations, alcohol regulation. They develop their whole set of laws. They develop all their social services, from environmental protection and environmental protection services to children and family services, to health aids, to dental services, to diabetes prevention, on and on. This is an actual tribal government I'm showing you, operating under these policies of self-determination. They develop all the economic backup that a community needs in terms of education, zoning and land use regulation, business opportunity programs, so forth and so on. They develop all the full panoply you might expect of a fully functioning tribal government around culture, with everything from libraries to festivals to the restoration of tribal language. All right, so that's a pitch which tells you we think that the reason the Wabanakis are underperforming so much is because they've been blocked from developing that thick government I just raced through. You know, where the point of those slides was there are a lot of lines. That is, lots of law development, lots of service development, lots of program development. What's it matter to the state of Maine? And this will be my closing remarks now. How does this matter to the state of Maine? We've done some economic modeling, which asks the following question. Suppose the tribes in Maine had access to the full range of self-governing powers that tribes in the other lower 48 states have. Suppose they had the tribes in Maine had those powers and started to develop the government. And suppose as a result, they were able to move up to the average of their peers. In other words, move up to the line in this chart I've been showing you. What would that look like? We're not saying this is a prediction, because there's a burden here on the Wabanakis themselves. And that burden, and when I talk to the Wabanaki Nations and other tribes, I say the same thing. You guys can fight for your rights of self-government and self-determination, but unless you can govern well, you'll fall flat on your face. You're just like other nations in the world. But under self-government, you would have expected, well, maybe some of the Maine tribes would do better, like the dots above the line there, or maybe they would do worse. But we asked the question, suppose they just got to the average. And the numbers you see there in red are the additional jobs that would be associated with the jobs either in tribal government or tribal enterprises that would be associated with self-governing Wabanaki nations that are at least able to lift themselves to the average performance of their peer tribes elsewhere in the United States. It amounts to 1,400 jobs. See the numbers out on the far right out there. It amounts to 1,400 jobs. That's not huge in the state of Maine, but I noticed in the Maine paper, I was in Bangor, and the Bangor paper was talking about new employer coming in having like 40 new jobs for local regions. These are big numbers. These are big numbers. And those jobs that would be associated with better performing Wabanaki nations, were they to be freed from the MICSA restraints, they have spillover effects. The worker for the tribe working in the new Child Protection Services Department, she goes and spends her money in a local grocery store in Orono or wherever it might be, in Washington County or wherever it might be. That creates income and taxes and so forth in the local grocery stores and so forth and so on. And I won't bore you with the details, but through some economic modeling, we have ways of looking at, well, how big is that impact? And that tells us the stakes for all of Maine. And here's what we find. In terms of GDP, for example, the gross domestic product of the state of Maine, we think that MICSA and Maine's use of MICSA to block the application of federal policies of self-government for tribes in Maine is costing the state of Maine about $330 million a year. Again, not huge. Maine's economy is I think it's about a $52 billion, $62 billion economy. But locally, those are big impacts. And the jobs that would be created, and you can see data there on the jobs that would be supported in these communities as a result of the direct employment by the tribal nations, as well as the spillover impacts, would be quite large. And in each of the counties, for example, our data show that these tribes in Maine would go from being, the 30th largest employer to the number 1 or number 2 employer in the county, because they're relatively depopulated and relatively poor counties. Interestingly enough, like the rest of the United States, most of the jobs at stake here that are being left on the table, if you will, are actually non-Indian jobs. And the reason for that is that as tribes' economies expand, they routinely have to draw on non-Indian capacity to help them run their child protection services, help them run their law department, help them run their trash collection, their water and sewer departments, and so forth. There's also tribal government revenue at stake, tens of millions of dollars, and tens of millions of dollars in state and federal revenues. So the bottom line is that we conclude that not just the Wabanaki Nations, but the non-tribal citizens of Maine also are suffering as a result of the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act. There's an old adage in economics that you're never really better off if your neighbors are poor. And that seems to very much apply here in the state of Maine. So with that, I will stop, and I thank you for listening to me. I hope you have some questions, and would happy to take any of those questions. I don't know, Kathleen, if you want to read me questions, or people can raise their hands, whatever works.
Yeah, I think that sounds perfect. And thank you so much, Professor Kalt. We have a ton of questions in the chat. Folks can continue sending those to me through the chat. I'm going to do my best to weave together the ones that have common themes and get through as many as we possibly can. But I want to let everybody know that later this afternoon, you will get a link to this recording via email. And in that email, you'll also find a link to the full report. So there may be questions that we don't get to today. Hopefully that will be a good resource. We're going to include a couple of other links as well. Yesterday, the 5 chiefs from the Wabanaki Nations addressed the state legislature. It's the first time this has happened in more than 20 years, only second time in state history. If you didn't catch that live, I suspect many of you were actually at the State House yesterday, but if you didn't catch that address, we will include a link to the recording. Very, very powerful speeches that really go to speak to the experience, as well as all the data that Professor Kalt shared today. There's also the human element, and really encourage you to watch those. You'll also find a link to a fact sheet about the legislation that's being negotiated now that would recognize the inherent sovereignty of the Wabanaki people, and a link to the Wabanaki Alliance, which has a whole bunch of resources and calls to action. So that will be a jam-packed email. Feel free to forward it around to anyone and everyone you know, and get them involved in this effort as well. If you are watching this recording on YouTube, you will find links to all of those resources in the caption, show notes, read more. You should be able to find it there. If not, shoot me an email and I'll get them to you. Okay, let's dive into these questions. I have to say, Professor Kalt, if there was one big theme, I would boil it down to just two words: how and why. This is so powerful. The data you shared is just heartbreaking, shameful. Those are some of the words that are showing up in the chat here. And how has this continued? How has it, I know you've made the rounds and gotten to talk to a lot of folks in the state of Maine in the last couple of weeks. Why isn't this fixed already?
Part of this, Kathleen, is I turn it back to everybody on the screen, and you guys explain Maine politics to me, because I've been shocked. It's kind of wild. You've got a governor who's basically threatened to veto this legislation despite bipartisan support that would change these provisions. What we find, I'm not an expert on Maine politics. You guys, I'm sure, are much better at that than I am. But what I do observe is this. No governments like to give up jurisdiction. That's true at the city level, the county level, the state level, the nation state level. And what we find is in Maine, for example, the Attorney General fairly routinely, the tribes and the Attorney General at odds over these things, for example. And so in some sense, it's that no one wants to give up jurisdiction. Sometimes it's specific areas like environmental regulation and so forth, or control of schools or child protection services. But what I can comment, and what I've been trying to convey I addressed the State House in Augusta last week, convey is that when you look around the rest of the country, here's what you find. Early in the stage of tribes building their capacity, they start out, their police department is underdeveloped relative to the state highway patrol or the county sheriff, whatever it might be, or their health clinics are under. As the tribe gets its act together and rises up, what happens is you see dramatic improvement in intergovernmental relations between tribe and state, tribe and county, tribe and city. And there's an underlying reason for that. And it is when there's a power imbalance, but you're in a fight, it's always going to be kind of a nasty fight. Once people are more equally balanced there, and your tribal cops or your state cops are trained in the same way my tribal cops are, and my foster care licensing program follows the same strict standards that your state program follows, it's funny how people start to cooperate. And what felt like a loss of jurisdiction starts to feel like a healthier, let's just get the needs of the people met. Because after all, that's what we want state and local government to do. And I am involved in, I've worked for both states and counties and for tribes and some mediations, for example, where I'm involved now where the counties and the tribes are lobbying together to get the state to change things, for example, because down on the ground, people start to experience, hey, if my neighbor isn't poor, we're all better off. If my neighbor has a better welfare program for juvenile delinquents, we're all better off. If my neighbor has a better fire department, we're all better off. And so I don't know exactly what runs deep in Maine politics, but I can tell you what it looks like when people get past this initial, oh, I never want to give up jurisdiction kind of tension.
Thank you. That I'm seeing lots of smiles and nodding heads when we think about that goal of state and local government to meet the needs of the people. That it feels so basic.
I have to give you one more remark. And it comes from, I make jokes about driving rental cars across rural America. I've done it for 35 years. In what I just described, you would not be surprised if what I'm saying was true about cooperation and so forth. It's funny how some of the racism starts to go away. Racism that sometimes can go in both directions, because suddenly people start to see, look, we're all trying to do the same thing. None of us wants the drunken driver out on the road. None of us wants the kids into drugs. None of us wants the schools to be lousy. And so you start to see in that cooperation very much on the ground reductions in the racism that so often has pervaded the relationships between tribes and non-tribal communities. As a human being, of course, I find that very gratifying, but it comes about as a result of improving that power imbalance that has so long been in favor of the dominant society as opposed to the tribes.
That is so encouraging, and really it feels, I know there are a lot of us Maine conservation voters, lots of folks on the call, lots of people across the state have been working so hard to support our Wabanaki neighbors and get the state to recognize their inherent sovereignty. It's really encouraging to have that sort of, like, this can work. It works in lots of other places. If you were in the prediction business, how long do you think it would take? How long do you think it will take once we get sovereignty acknowledged the way it should be in the state of Maine for some of those economic impacts to turn around, to get the Wabanaki Nations closer to those other charts, other lines on the graph?
It's interesting you asked that, and your question reminds me. I realize I really am a kind of nerdy economist professor, because we're actually working. We haven't produced yet a paper on this question, because not just for Maine, but we talk among ourselves as researchers about the 20-year rule. These places we've seen, when they get onto the self-governance kick and start to take things over, it usually 15 to 20 years, you start to see this kind of, if you had hidden your eyes for 20 years and then opened them, oh my God, look what's happened. And so it does, in other words, it's not overnight. A lot of it comes from the self-governing process starts out relatively slow. You're okay. you're going to build a new blank program, child protection services, after school recreation program, whatever it might be. And you hire a new 24-year-old tribal member, tribal citizen to be the director, and it's a pretty low-level program. But 10 years later, that tribal director, well, she's learned how to fundraise for her after-school program, and she's turned into a good manager, and she's learned how to budget. And wait a minute, now we appoint her, she's now running the next, and 20 years later, she's chairwoman of the tribe. Okay, I mean, I'm thinking of actual cases in my own head. I want to stress something here. That chart I show you with the little dots on it, there's lots of tribes below the average too. They're not all perfect. And that's this lesson that we say to tribes. You can talk the talk of sovereignty and self-government, but it's like other governments in the world, other communities in the world. If you get those powers of self-government, but can't exercise them well, you can fall flat on your face. We say from Poland to Potawatomi, you can fall flat on your face if you can't exercise the ability to self-govern. But that's where the accountability comes from. Well, wait a minute, says the tribal chair. Now they blame me if something goes wrong. I better get a better attorney. I better get a better qualified person to run my anti-drug program or whatever it might be. And so it's a process of learning. But that's the kind of pattern, that's the pattern we see across the rest of the United States.
Such an important reminder that what we're talking about is not a transition from a bad system to a perfect system, yeah. Right? We're not, sovereignty would not be a magic wand that would make everything sunshine and rainbows, but it is, that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, right? We're not looking for something to be perfect.
Yeah, and again, like the data I showed you on cutting poverty in half, there's still places, including outside of Maine, that are, shockingly poor. But the fact that you've pulled up the lives of people on average is a very encouraging sign, because it means the widespread trend is one of improving economic development, improving cultural strength, improving social conditions. And that's, I don't want to be a Pollyanna. That's why I'm stressing right now. There's still some places that are deeply troubled. But at least by opening up the door of opportunity, more often than not, tribes have run through that door to success rather than to continue disempowerment and impoverishment.
You mentioned that tribes as they build that muscle of self-government and begin to sort of exert that regulatory authority, that there are some impacts that we're talking about the state giving up control. There might be impacts that the state doesn't like, particularly given our audience today. I wonder if you could speak to what that looks like in terms of natural resource management and environmental standards. That's one of the frequently cited, well, we couldn't ever do this because we'd worry about that. What does it look like?
Overall patterns, and then some of the deviations from that pattern. Overall patterns is first, under most federal environmental law, those laws now routinely include a clause known in the business as TAS, tribes as states. And what that means is that under, say, Clean Water Act amendments, for example, the tribe can take over the management. They're still subject to federal law, environmental standards, but the tribe can take over the enforcement and administration of those policies if the tribe can demonstrate that it has policies of its own that are no less strict than the applicable federal law, and that it has the management and essentially bureaucratic capacity to carry out those things. That states can do that as well. I lived in Massachusetts, and Massachusetts for years and years and years fought with the federal government because Massachusetts didn't want to clean up the Charles River where Harvard University is. Okay. But tribes can do that. So that's first, just understand legally, the tribes don't have the willy-nilly ability to just like suspend all environmental law. Having said that, and the overall pattern is the following. More often than not, what tribes do is they develop their own environmental protection agencies, their own game and fish departments, their own forestry departments, and they enforce laws that are typically no less stringent than state or federal laws. And importantly, where we do see conflict arises. So we've worked with a tribe out in New Mexico on the Rio Grande River, adopts its own water quality standards, starts to enforce them, which impinges upon the upstream polluters, including, for example, the city of Albuquerque, and there's conflict. Oh, the Indian tribes are telling us what to do. Well, they're only actually enforcing federal law. And we find that fairly frequently, that groups will oppose tribal jurisdiction in environmental affairs or natural resource affairs. And what they're actually doing is they're getting away with murder under lack of state enforcement, for example, or federal enforcement. And the tribe is stepping in and becoming a better enforcer. Having said that, because I want to paint the clear picture, sometimes tribes will do things that, and I'm actually vice chair and been on the board forever of a big conservation organization, and they're based in Tucson, actually, known as the Sonoran Institute. We're trying to protect the desert, blah, blah, blah. We find tribes do things that conservation voters, not so sure about that. Give you the flavor though. Worked with a tribe in Arizona. They wanted to build a ski resort. There were 2 mountains on the reservation, and the tribe built a ski resort on one of them, and they were opposed by national conservation organizations. The tribe's view was, we have to build a place where people want to and can live by having jobs and so forth. Tellingly, one of the mountains was a sacred mountain, and the tribe was never going to build a ski resort on that mountain because they have their own cultural values. Okay, so I often say I come from the white yuppie tribe. Okay. And we do absolutely crazy things, like we protect the Grand Canyon from development. Think how cool it would be. We could have hotels spilling over the side, but those are our cultural values. And we would no more think of, not letting the Grand Canyon be protected than we try to fly. Tribes have their own values. They may differ from other people's values, but that's part of what self-government is about. Is being able to implement your own values. And so that's the flavor. More generally, and last remark, is this word cooperation. And so I know a big thing has been, there's actually been some Supreme Court cases in the West, Montana, Wyoming. Tribe wins basically enforcement of its treaty rights, which allow historic treaty rights allowing off-reservation hunting of elk, for example. And the non-Indian community, oh my God, the Indians are going to kill all the, no, the tribe builds its own game and fish department, and they end up with joint agreements, and they end up figuring out how to work together because everybody wants the same basic thing, which is, we don't want to kill all the elk. So it's that people need to understand. Often it's early conflict followed by cooperation as the tribe builds its capacity to sit as an equal at these negotiation tables.
Professor Kalt, I feel like we've barely scratched the surface, and we're at the end of our hour together. I am so grateful to you. I'm grateful to everyone who joined today and asked really spectacular questions, only a handful of which we got to actually ask and answer, but I am so grateful to you. Reminder to everybody, you will get the link to the full report. Hopefully some of those answers you'll find in there, and we will continue this work together. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. I hope you will join us again next week when we will have some folks who are going to talk about outdoor school for all Maine students. It is going to be another really important bill that is before the legislature this year to get all Maine kids out into the natural world. And again, Professor Kalt, thank you, thank you, thank you. You have really given us a great gift of information and really compelling and encouraging vision. So we're going to keep working towards that, and know that we'll keep you posted. And
well, thank you for having me. I hope people enjoyed this, and good luck to all of you in your work.
Thank you.
Take care.